Hello, everybody. Hello to those of you in the room here at the Multilateral Development Bank's shared pavilion at COP28 in Dubai, and welcome to those of you joining us online as well. I think we have all reason to celebrate that the pressing issue of adaptation is very much center stage at this COP. And those of you who've been working so hard on this agenda will agree that it's about time. What is also a reason to celebrate is the success of the updated methodology on tracking adaptation finance into development projects. Now, for those of you listening online who are beginning to think, oh my God, that sounds so technical. It is technical, but it's hugely important, because if we're going to get the finance into those projects, we have to speak the same language. And that's what this is about. Last year at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, my colleague and her fellows from the Multilateral Development Banks presented the updating methodology that had been the fruit of many years of hard labor, if I can put it that way. And now we've reason to tell you a bit more about what happened next. And I'm going to turn to our panelists in a moment to give us the good news on that. We're also going to look a bit more closely at how that methodology a year on is actually manifesting itself on the ground. How is it influencing the work of our partners? Where could we go next? It's going to be a very fruitful, rich, and above all, practical discussion. So let me first of all introduce to you, if I can put it this way, our two high-level panelists. And we have Marie Bjornsen, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Agence Française de Développement. Welcome, Marie, who is also speaking for the International Development Finance Club. You'll tell us a bit about that group and what you've got to tell us today. Also delighted to welcome Ambroise Fayolle, who is Vice President of the European Investment Bank, in charge of climate and development. So I'm going to hand over to you. I'm going to introduce you to our other panelists in a moment. You'll have to stay in suspense for a moment, but Marie, please, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say a few words as an introduction. First of all, we all agree that there is a need for accelerating climate adaptation finance. The challenge is major, but finance adaptation is not on the path, and needs are growing. Indeed, development countries currently need about 212 billion per year in adaptation finance up to 2030, which means that adaptation finance flows must quadruple. In this context, the common principles constitute a strong and joint engagement towards consistency and transparency of the climate finance. And indeed, it's technical, but it's also crucial. And today, I'm very pleased to announce that after the adoption of the methodology last September in Marrakesh, IDFC and MDBs have adopted an updated methodology for the CPs. This updated version brings positive changes with more clarity and also precision on adaptation finance tracking. This methodology also takes into account the experience gained since 2015 and is fully in line with the best practices. And here I would like to thank again the members of MDBs and IDFC Climate Group who actively participate to the exchanges last year. And considering the differences of maturity of practices and capacities, it was agreed that IDFC members will have a grace period of 2 years before applying those updated CPs. I also would like to underline that adaptation finance is critical for IDFC. IDFC Green Finance Mapping Report, published last September, shows adaptation finance reached a record, increasing 52% to nearly $32 billion. And for instance, AFD Group, presents a proportion of climate adaptation finance similar to multilateral donors among the most active in adaptations, such as the World Bank and the Africa Development Bank. To conclude, we believe that these revised CPs pave the road towards more collaboration and also transparency, but also volume and impact that are so critically needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie. Thank you so much. And of course, that is potentially a real game changer. The fact that the International Development Finance Club has joined means that suddenly there's not just more volumes that are respecting that new methodology, but also using the same language, and that is the key phrase. Let me hand over now to Ambroise Fayolle, Vice President of the European Investment Bank. Ambroise.
Thank you very much, Shirin. Good afternoon to all of you. Thanks a lot for coming. Many thanks to the panelists. Many thanks to Marie. Let me start by saying something on IDFC and why it is so important that we work together as MDBs with IDFC. And you know, there is an initiative that has been launched a few years ago by the chief executive of the French Development Agency, so Marie's boss, Rémi Rioux, who has created the Finance in Common. And Finance in Common is the gathering of 530 public development banks, be it multilateral or public or bilateral development banks. IDFC is a subgroup of this, and obviously very important banks. But my point is, what is really important is that multilateral development banks do not speak among themselves only, that they have a clear dialogue with other public development banks. And because at the end of the day, and we are here talking about something which is very important, which is the methodology and tracking finance adaptation, that we apply the same rule for the benefit of our clients and the countries that we support. And actually, that's why I'm very, very pleased that IDFC and the members that compose IDFC is going to join this initiative. And that for two reasons. One that has been mentioned by Shirin, which is clearly, I mean, of course, we all have done plenty of adaptation projects over the last years, be it in the water sector, be it in increasing resilience to heat, temperature, etc. But the truth is, what is also important is to be able to measure it and to measure it the same way. And that's what the work that has been launched and presented in Sharm el-Sheikh, the last COP, was so important, and that's why it is really good that today we are able to present the adaptation tracking. As you said, Shirin, to speak the same language is very important. So that doesn't mean that we all have to exactly do the same thing, but at least we can speak the same language. And also, this is important because it drives the finance to those who need the most. So I will just stop here, but to me, it is really something that should help us move adaptation upwards. We need more projects on adaptation. We need more streamlining of adaptation projects. The figure that we have published as in the joint MDB climate report in September are good and bad. They are good because they are up 23 billion euros for adaptation for the group of 10 multilateral development banks. So that is up 5 billion compared with, it's more than what we expected to reach in 25. So it is good, but actually it is small compared with the needs. And actually maybe also the methodology and etc. will allow to not only to provide more financing, but also to identify things that we do as adaptation and we don't even necessarily recognize as adaptation. So I'll stop there, but just by thanking a lot Cinzia and her team, because we have been blessed to have you as a co-chair of the MDB working group on adaptation finance for the last 3 years. I mean, it is a lot of work together with the colleagues from the Islamic Development Bank. So we are going to pass this pleasure to another multilateral development bank. And I just wanted to make sure that you are aware of the recognition and awareness of the EIB management of all the work that you and your team have worked. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Now, I'm going to liberate both you and Marie here now. Thank you so much for your contributions. We're going to turn to the panel in a moment, but first, let's refresh ourselves on what it is all about. And Cinzia, I'd like to invite you as lead on adaptation at the EIB, but most importantly, as one of a team of multilateral development banks who've been working on this hugely important aspect. And I will let you run us through it and get out of the way for a minute.
Okay, thank you very much and good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Cinzia Loseno. I'm from the European Investment Bank, and over the last 3 years, I had the privilege of co-chairing the NDB's working group on adaptation finance. I can see in the audience many of my colleagues, so thank you very much for coming to support this event. And I'd like to start by saying that what I'm going to present in the next 7 or 8 minutes, I hope no longer than that, is the effort of the adaptation experts, the lead experts on adaptation finance of the 10 biggest multilateral development banks. So it's not my work, it's the work of the joint effort of these experts that I'm going to present here. And in the audience, I also see colleagues from the IDFC, so welcome to you too. I'm very pleased to see you here today. We've been working together for several years, in fact, actually more than 10 years. So it's a fantastic moment for us to be able to now work under the same umbrella, under the same definitions, under the same methodology for adaptation finance. So kudos to you, IDFC, and particularly FDEF for your support. Thank you. Okay, so let's see if this works. Yeah, I am pressing. No. I need help with the slides, please. 1 minute, okay.
Just talk among yourselves.
Yes, okay, so I think what it's important about this methodology is that it integrates definitions of adaptation finance. So what is it that we call adaptation activities? And whilst it may sound trivial, you will not believe it, but we didn't used to have them. We didn't used to have clear definition up. Okay, I can move it from here. All right, we didn't have clear definition of what adaptation activity was in the past. So that's one big advantage. But let's start with a little bit of history so that you can see the evolution over times. We launched a common methodology for tracking adaptation finance in 2012, so over 10 years ago. And then a few years later, in Paris, at COP28, we launched common principles on adaptation finance tracking, which were high-level principles guiding the way we track adaptation finance jointly with IDFC. So our collaboration with IDFC goes back several years. Over the years, we've worked towards improving our understanding of what adaptation really is, what the needs are, and how to really ensure highest impact on the ground by mobilizing the finance to where it's most needed. We've done that working together over the years. Last year, we came to Sharm el-Sheikh to present an updated methodology, really to take stock of the latest developments, and I'll talk about them in a minute. And last year, we said we'll come back to report on progress, and here we are, to report on progress to you and celebrate with you this fantastic moment of working together with the IDFC. You can see also the trends on NDB's adaptation finance over the years and how it's really jumped up, and is what the European Investment Bank Vice President was mentioning. Good news, it's definitely going up, but as we all know, the volumes are not quite there, and we really need to work together as financial institutions to really support the needs of countries and clients. Okay, so why do we embark in a review, an update of the methodology that culminated in the launch last year? Was really to take stock of the latest developments in the world of adaptation finance, and particularly internal developments in our financial institutions, and I'm sure that IDFC members also can reflect their experience in these developments. The way we provide finance has changed dramatically over the last 10 years. It's not just about a couple of sectors, as it used to be, water and agriculture nominally, but we really now cover a variety of sectors. It's not about investment or grant finance, but it's a variety of financial products that now we deploy to support adaptation in a variety of countries with a variety of clients. So much more flavor, much more diversity compared to 10 years ago. And the other reason was external developments, really to do with the advancements on adaptation finance that had happened outside the world NDBs, mainly to do with the EU sustainable finance and the taxonomy for adaptation finance that was released in the Climate Delegated Act 2 years ago, and from then onwards with these updates. So we really wanted to take stock of the changes in the way we provide finance, in the way we respond to the needs of the clients, as well as the changes and the developments in broader ecosystems of financial institutions and the financial market operating on adaptation. We embarked in a consultation process and review process that lasted over 2 years, and we don't need to go into the details, but just to say that stakeholders, internal and external stakeholders, were part of the consultations and really contributed with a significant input to ensure that the methodology in its updated version really responded to the needs of countries. And if we dive into the methodology very briefly, I would say what's new. There is fundamentally 2 new aspects in the updated methodology. One is that there are definitions of adaptation finance, or adaptation activities, as I was saying earlier. But there is also a way, an initial framework to track adaptation finance in other instruments other than direct finance, which we didn't have earlier. So I'm thinking about intermediated lending, equity and funds, working capital. Okay, what has not changed at all is really the 3 steps approach. And this is the gold standard, let's say, in adaptation finance on how to identify potential impacts to a project, and then understand these impacts, understand, that there is commitment from the financial institution and the client to address these potential impacts, and then identify measures to address these impacts. And this three-steps approach has always been at the core of what we define as adaptation finance since the very onset of a methodology. It's a way of disaggregating what contributes to adapt from what doesn't, as other, very important, but other development objectives. If we dive into the definitions very briefly of adaptation activities, we came up with 3. So in our view, these 3 definitions, these 3 buckets should cover all possible ways of adapting to climate change. The first type is very simple, is what many call proofing, climate proofing, and it's about ensuring adjustments or improvements in a project or a project component so that it can cope with future climate. Okay, we call them adapted activities. The second bucket is a bit broader, probably, and is to do with activities that contribute to adaptation, help countries, clients, business cities, whatever they might be, to adapt to climate change, but at the same time, they help with other development objectives. And these type of activities are very common in sectors like water, agriculture, where maybe the activity is still the same. You're not doing something very different, but you're doing it for a number of reasons, including adaptation. And the third bucket is to do with what we call more the transformational adaptation. It's the sort of activities that we must do to really enable adaptation in a broader way. And there are activities that are fully motivated by the need to adapt. And just to maybe create a link to the taxonomy, I give a bit of clarity on as to how these 3 buckets may be consistent with the EU taxonomy on adaptation finance. They very much reflect the 2 broader categories that the taxonomy indicates as adapted activities and enabling activities. Okay, so we worked to really ensure full consistency with these latest developments. I have examples. I don't know, Shirin, how am I doing with time?
I think we need to move on.
Okay. Let's say very happy to maybe discuss with you in more details what these 3 activities are. Thank you very, very much for coming today, and really looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cinzia. And I guess this is really an evolving methodology, isn't it? It's going to become more meaningful, deeper, more nuanced. But we can already use it. And that's the great news. And I think, so I want to move to the first part of our panel. And I guess this is also to hear from you all what it is that the IDFC, I know you're from Agence Française anyway, but what can the MDBs actually take on board from your perspective in applying this methodology, in developing, and applying, implementing it? In a moment, we're going to be hearing from our colleagues at the multilateral development banks, but first let me introduce who we have here. So we have Karima Dejia, who is the Deputy Director of the Bridgetown Initiative Unit. I know all of you know that Barbados has been leading the conversation on the reform of the financial system, but also on making sure that adaptation is sort of key there. So it's great to have you with us, Karima. We're also very happy to have Baisa Naran, who is from the Climate Policy Initiative, who can give us a really unique perspective on how we are doing on actually driving in the money into this area. It may not be a pretty picture, but it certainly will motivate us. We're also very happy to have, also from the Agence Française de Développement, the new partner in this, and also giving us that perspective from the AFD, Atika Ben Maid, who's Deputy Head of Climate and Nature. So great that you're joining us. And Feridun Tur, who is the Head of Economics Research at the Industrial Development Bank of Turkey. So thank you for joining us. Let me kick off with you, Karima, first of all. What is your perspective from Barbados in terms of the kind of direction that you would like to see the MDBs, the IDFC going in terms of adaptation? And what's your experience in Barbados of actually doing that work in adaptation?
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting us to be on this panel, for the opportunity to speak to you today on this topic. I think that this issue sort of gets to the heart of the place where the international multilateral systems are meeting the work that the country is doing, or the countries are doing. And if we try to unpack that a little bit, we have the multilateral system of the COP itself, where countries are agreeing on what we are going to do to address climate change. And then we can think of finance globally as a system that needs to provide the finance as a means of implementation to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and the goals of the Paris Agreement. And those things are obviously interacting, and then of course those are interacting with the countries and what we are doing and what we are signing on to agree. And Barbados has been vocal, and thank you for what you've said in terms of our call for action in terms of the Bridgetown Initiative. So we've been vocal both inside the COP and outside the COP with the Bridgetown Initiative and calling for reform of that global system, but not just a call with tangible proposals and tangible actions for what can be done to better align the system and to increase the flows of finance where they need to go. And so I'm going, in the interest of being concise, I'm not going to give you a full overview of what is the Bridgetown Initiative. The information is out there. Many of you are aware. I'll give you a shameless plug to come over to the Barbados Pavilion to check out the content that we have there and some of the explainers.
Shameless plug is fine.
So, in terms of adaptation and what we're saying about that, just to focus in a little bit, adaptation is where we see that there are fewer opportunities than with mitigation for revenue streams. And therefore, in Bridgetown, what we're saying is that this is a system where there are different needs that need to be met in different ways. And so it's adaptation where we see the biggest opportunity for the MDBs to take a leading role with increasing, doubling, tripling concessional lending for adaptation, because that is where that type of finance is most needed and most suited. But when we take that down now to the country level a little bit, in terms of tracking adaptation finance, because we can set goals and we can sort of see how we optimize the system, and that's sort of top down, but we have to then come bottom up as well and say, okay, what are we doing and how are we tracking that? And in terms of tracking it, we really welcome this understanding that adaptation and resilience building are not separate from development. They're not separate from prosperity, indeed. They must be integrated. We have to recognize those synergies and those nuances. And I'll also say that for SIDS and many other developing and vulnerable countries, I was having a conversation with a colleague this morning, what we might term mitigation for other countries is actually in some ways resilience for us as well. Because as the world transitions, we cannot afford to be left behind. We have to be ready with our own transition so that we're still functional as the world moves on to other sources of energy and other ways of doing business. So these things are inextricably linked. So you've set yourself a difficult task here to sort of unpack, well, what is adaptation and how do we tag and flag adaptation and direct where what goes? So we recognize the value of standardization. Standardization in any system is helpful and useful. But we also caution that the tracking frameworks must incorporate flexibility to recognize these nuances and these synergies that I've just touched on, and how highly context-dependent and country-driven adaptation is by nature. I also want to emphasize that, and this is again showing these, how these different systems and the COP and the finance system are linked. As we talk about aligning ourselves with Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, low carbon and resilient development are not necessarily mutually inclusive. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive either, but they're not mutually inclusive. So I'll give an example, one that we've been talking a lot about recently in Barbados, is very relevant for us. Coastal protection infrastructure, and this is something we've worked with the IDB a lot on in Barbados. So we are under threat from coastal erosion, from extreme events that are related to climate change and sea level rise. And we may need to install coastal protection infrastructure, breakwaters, revetments, seawalls. These are going to involve, to be done with high quality, they're going to involve armor stone, they're going to involve concrete. And this is not just any stone or any concrete. This is going to be high-strength marine concrete. This is going to be durable armor stone materials. I have an engineering background. I could talk about this all afternoon. I won't. But these are things those are not low-emission materials. Indeed. In terms of that concrete, in terms of, especially for SIDS, a need to import a lot of those materials. But that is what we need for effective resilience building in that sector. Well, we cannot do that and have that particular project both low carbon and resilient.
Unless we come up with a way of making those products in a greener way, right?
Well, I think that we can improve, but at the end of the day, Barbados is not going to magically start producing, durable armor stone. I could go into our geology and why not, but those things will not magically start happening. Yeah. So I will also say that pathways to a low carbon and resilient future are going to vary from country to country, and so how we sort of think about this is, and we've emphasized this, is having a programmatic approach for Barbados, where the work that we need to do, it may be packaged as projects, but it is aligned to a set of clear national objectives. And that allows us, the contributions of the specific projects to those objectives may vary. This project may emphasize adaptation and it may be structured in this way, and this other project may emphasize mitigation. We might have projects that combine them in various ways. But what is important is that the overall country program is taking us on that pathway to low carbon and resilient development, but recognizing that the individual needs and how we package that, if we take that project by project, it's a little more nuanced. And I think that's maybe the biggest sort of takeaway that I would like to leave you with today.
I'm going to warn the MDB colleagues who are going to come up after you to discuss this that I might depart from some of the set questions. So you need to be aware, because I do want to come back on some of the things that our panelists are bringing up. I'm making some notes here. I think that's a really important point that you make about the need for nuance and the need to recognize within the methodology that there are going to be different routes and different country-specific needs. So thank you for that, Karima. Let me turn to Baisa now. Baisa, your global landscape of climate finance essentially produces an inventory of climate finance, where it's going, from whom, for what.
Yes.
Give us a perspective, though, on adaptation finance. What's the state of play?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think I should probably start with a bit of a perspective around how all this work around tracking adaptation finance and also combining all these standards, standardizing the data is impacting globally, right? So we are essentially data collectors. We aggregate all of the data that's available, and we try to build a picture of a collective progress. And our global landscape of climate finance then feeds into all the larger processes, such as those that are happening in the negotiation rooms, the UNFCCC processes, the IPCC report, and now increasingly the private sector is also looking into our report, try to understand what's happening globally and regionally and in different sectors. And in that sense, it's extremely important for us such that our readers are able to trust our data, they're able to compare the data and make a decision, objective decision based out of our database. So, of course, tracking standards is a process. We're improving all collectively. And our collaboration with the IDFC and the MDB groups is very, very helpful to us, and we are looking forward to continue our work together. So just to go into sort of the trends in adaptation finance based on the available data. So adaptation finance reached $63 billion on an annual average basis in 2021 and 2022. So this is a record high, which is great news. But if we put things into perspective of mitigation finance, it's of course very low. So mitigation finance, for example, exceeded $1 trillion in 2021 and 2022. So maybe it's one of the reasons why adaptation finance should be on the top of the agenda. We're not seeing equal split between mitigation and adaptation. Of course, we can say there are like methodological issues, we need to improve the data, but it's not sticking into our face that adaptation finance is super high. Now, we're really looking for data everywhere, right? And the reality is that for now, adaptation finance is merely 5% compared to total climate finance. So, and for now, tracked adaptation finance is dominantly from the public sector, and then there's very little private sector adaptation finance. And currently, those that we're able to track is mostly through philanthropic funding, and then we're able to track some projects here and there that are relevant to adaptation finance. So adaptation finance was largely channeled as debt and mostly distributed between water and wastewater sector, but also another sector called cross-sectoral solutions, because I think it's also related to the issue that adaptation is a very overarching theme. It cannot be sort of split between development agenda. The work with DFIs, they provide the most of the tracked adaptation finance. And I would echo what Cinzia, you mentioned that, adaptation finance tracking is currently the gold standard. We also see that across different data sources that we collect. The other thing is, perhaps with the current standard that is currently being built, it is a stepping stone so that this can be overspilled to other finance by other adaptation finance providers. And we still need to see a lot more progress from the private sector, for example. There are more standards to be built there. So the other thing, just to mention that there are different numbers going on. Like there's an OECD data and there's CPI data. A lot of people ask like why we have different numbers. And then just to clarify that is we collect data in terms of what's happening domestically as well. So for example, through our collaboration with the IDFC members, which include a lot of national development banks, right? So we track also domestic adaptation finance that is flowing locally. So that really helps us to build a global picture in terms of adaptation finance. So
Thank you. Thank you so much, Baisa. That's really useful to have that overview. And I'm guessing that we can kind of find all that on your website as well, right? Yes. So for those who couldn't take it all in, there's more to learn and more to find out. Let's turn to Agence Française de Développement. You're active, very active, particularly in Africa, 44 African countries, actually. And I'd like to ask you a sort of two-pronged question, if I may. First of all, tell us a bit about what you found out through your recent assessment of adaptation projects in sub-Saharan Africa, but also a little bit about how you think, as a member of the International Development Finance Club, this methodology might help you in terms of directing your projects in adaptation as well.
Thank you, Shireen. I might start maybe by saying that actually the numbers you were talking about and the tracking is also on IDFC website. Right. Because my friends from the Secretariat are here, so the Green Finance Mapping has particularly a focus on the adaptation agenda this year. So that's something that I wanted to start with. So as it was said by most of the people that talked before me, the adaptation agenda is actually really high in this COP, and we see that really positively at AFD. Of course, the fact that it started by the adoption of the Loss and Damage Fund from the first day, and with commitment from several countries, including France, and also the fact that during this COP we have announced on our side additional contribution to, France side, additional contribution to the adaptation fund is also something that we see positively. So it's really timely that this announcement is made today of the IDFC joining MDBs in following these common principles. And on the fact that we are not yet at the level of the challenge of adaptation finance. I just want also to jump on something you have said about the fact that we are at 5% of the total climate finance. That is adaptation finance. And actually, it has reduced. It was 7%. On top of not being sufficiently, as a relative share of the total climate finance, it has reduced from 7% to 5%. So that's something also to show how much it is our new challenge as financiers, as development bank, to try to tackle it and to put that even higher in the agenda. At AFD, we are the first public development bank that was 100% Paris aligned since 2017, and we have some targets, objectives of climate finance. Our objective is 50% of climate finance and 30% for adaptation. As of 2022, it was a record year. We were higher than our expectations. We are at 62% of our annual financing in climate finance, which is 6.9 billion euros. And it included 2.2 billion euros for adaptation. And even it's a high number, what does that mean? For AFD, between 2015 and 2022, we have quadrupled our adaptation finance. And I'll come to how we have worked to quadruple this adaptation finance. And to elaborate on that, I want to say we have said, a lot of us, the numbers about adaptation finance, but something that is also important in the common principle and in the elaboration of the roadmap on support to adaptation challenges is not only the quantity, it's the quality of adaptation finance. And that's really, really important for us internally to look at the quality of adaptation finance. To let you know a little bit, and I'm going to be a little bit operational, practical, how do we assess the project at AFD? Every time we have a project, we have to assess it against a country climate sheets. And the country climate sheets integrates both mitigation and adaptation. When there is a long-term strategy in the country, of course, we build on the long-term strategy, the low carbon and resilient. As you said, it's really a music to my ear that you're reminding that actually low carbon doesn't mean that we have to forget the resilient part of the development pathway of Article 4.19 of the Paris Agreement. And actually, what we do also now, since a few years now, we have a climate risk screening tool. Every single project presented at the identification committee of AFD, which is the first committee, has to be assessed against this climate risk screening tool. It doesn't have to be a climate project. Any kind of project has to go through that tool so that we can identify if there are risks that have to be taken into account, vulnerabilities that have to be taken into account, so that during the appraisal process, the project team can go further and try to advise on how to integrate climate. And maybe a recent example I had recently with one of my colleagues covering the health sector. It was a project on hospitals to increase the health services in Martinique, in the Caribbean. And the climate was not integrated, but because of the screening tool, we were assessing the risk of flooding because of the position. And initially, it was not a climate project. So that's really important to have this systematic approach on all and every single project. On top of our projects, there is also, at AFD, we are doing, and all the details are on a TCFD report that we just released, the second TCFD report 2 weeks ago or 2 or 3 weeks ago in English. And we are trying in the report, we are showing what are our procedures on our governance to report on our exposure to climate risks. And all these procedures are actually written in this report. Another aspect also is the financial intermediation, because I think Cynthia was also presenting one of the categories, which is financial intermediation. As part of our due diligence, risk assessment on every financial institution we are supporting, we have to integrate part of on climate risks, both physical and transition. It's part of our procedures now. So it's not only the financial assessment that we are usually doing to look at the creditworthiness, to look at the KYC, we're also looking at the climate risks of our financial intermediary, mainly banks in our system. So, of course, we are doing well through the practices that I'm presenting, but what is important when we are a development institution and trying to improve our practices is to perform evaluation. And we have actually done an evaluation on adaptation in sub-Saharan Africa and Madagascar, and the report is online. I'll summarize. And the report is online, so I invite all of you to look at it. The interest of this evaluation, it was on a long life span, so it was from 2012 to 2018. And maybe the main messages of that evaluation is that we have to include more the monitoring of the adaptation impacts of our project, but also how to better target the vulnerable countries and population. How do we ensure that the impacts we are looking at on the vulnerabilities are actually being achieved? We also try to learn from the others, so we are also undergoing through a benchmark of practices of other partners, of course KfW, but also World Bank and USAID to go through that. We also have a few facilities that are targeting on adaptation, and that would be close to my last word. We have a program called Adaptation. On top of presenting this project, what I like is it has a participative approach in formulating the priority projects in the countries where adaptation is working. It's with the government, it's with civil society. Before even doing any feasibility study, we're trying to build with the community what would be the right response to the adaptation changes in the country of intervention. Last, given our focus, and as you can see, we have been developing a lot and elaborating a lot on improving our practices in adaptation finance. We are really happy that IDFC joining this, is adopting also these common principles on adaptation, these updates, and AFD being a part of IDFC is seeing that really positively. Because first, it improves, of course, as you say, we're going to speak the same language, and that's really important to ensure that we are consistent across partners. It also gives better monitoring and transparency. It's really important to be able to show to the citizens what we call adaptation finance and what is included in it. So our transparency is really high in our agenda. And lastly, for us, as AFD, we really appreciated the exchanges we had with other IDFC members first, and also with all MDB's partners, which allows to learn from each other and to try to improve our practices and to integrate within our own practices the best from the others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Atika. Thank you, and a lot of really important comments there that I want to come back to in a moment with the MDBs, especially on how that transparency element helps not just, as you say, the public, but also in terms of investment, especially when we're trying to crack that very difficult nut, which is the private sector bringing revenues in, something that you also mentioned, Karima. Let me turn to you, who's patiently been there, and the Turkish Industrial Development Bank, I guess as its raison d'etre, Feridun, has actually the mission to encourage economic development in Turkey, clearly. But to what extent now has the concern around adaptation finance, become a sort of part of your work? Are you mainstreaming it? How are you handling it? What are the challenges that you see in terms of both the country, but also how are you working with your clients on this area? Over to you, Feridun.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here with such distinguished participants. Actually, the Mediterranean region, Turkey is in the Mediterranean region, and it's one of the future hotspots about climate change impacts. Just to summarize what Turkey will face in the projections, that there will be much less precipitation in the southern part of the Turkey, and there will be intense precipitation other parts of the Turkey, and there will be floods and landslides, and there will be hotter days in all seasons. These are all, and also the intense and longer duration of droughts will face Turkey. So it's all about water issues, it seems like that. And it's not surprising, actually, as UN Water says, water is the medium that we see, we experiment the severe climate change impacts on us. And the policymaker has revealed a plan to mitigate these risks, to deal with these risks, and national adaptation strategy and an action plan in 2010. And it identifies 5 key pillars, and the majority of the pillars are directly or indirectly about water. So when we talk about adaptation in Turkey, it just sounds about water, we can say. So how is the water situation in Turkey now, not in the future? In the future it will be bad, but now how is it? We have 25 river basins, and 2/3 of the river basins are facing water scarcity now, and some of them face severe water scarcity. And these basins include largest cities of Turkey, largest industrial zones, and also agricultural production regions. So also we faced lots of droughts in the last decades, and then we exacerbated the groundwater depletion. So we actually use the reserves that we would need much as the climate change intensifies. So let me give you a number of a World Bank study for the water issues in Turkey. 10% decrease in water supply in Turkey would cause a 6% decrease in GDP, causing approximately $50 billion a year. So water is pivotal in adaptation. But you know, adaptation and resilience benefits are often invisible and hard to track because it's the first benefit is the avoiding the loss when risk realizes. And of course some projects have increasing productivity benefits, but it comes later. So in Turkey, this structure makes private sector to stand back. In Turkey,
not just in Turkey.
Yeah, not just, yeah. Adaptation investments are thought to be the job description of the government, local or central government. But actually we feel in the field that it's changing in Turkey now. Some private sector actors are demanding an adaptation investment, especially in water. And in TSKB we provide financial support for especially wastewater treatment facilities. So we help our clients to mitigate their vulnerability, to decrease their vulnerability to water scarcity risks, and also contribute to the national adaptation plans aim for water resources management. Finally, I want to add just what are we doing in economic research. I'm from economic research. We are studying water issues since 2018. And we track the water problem and in Turkey and share our perspectives in both our colleagues in the bank and outside the bank and all our stakeholders. And also we give some advisory services for the top-level management of the private sectors about the risks and importance of the mitigation of these risks. And Moreover, a specific advisory service that I want to mention is that we support the national campaign in Turkey, aiming to increase the public awareness of the water stress. And we were the strategic advisor of the project, and we calculated a water stress index, a high-frequency water stress index. And actually, it was quite impactful, so we are proud of that, and I want to mention. And it's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Feridun. And thank you to all of you here on this first part of the panel. Now, we're going to hear from the multilateral development banks in a moment, and I'm going to ask colleagues to be ready to switch our sound a bit. But first of all, let me thank all of you for helping us sort of set the scene. And I think in the next section, we'll ask a little bit about what the institutions are doing, but maybe speak to some of the points that have been raised here, in particular from the sort of Barbados and the Turkey perspective, questions around the role of supporting countries and their national plans, which seems to be extremely important, but also that really difficult one, the private sector, and the role of the MDBs. So anyway, thank you so much to you, Karima, Feridun, and also Atika, and also Kaiser as well. Baisa, thank you so much. And if you could just let your microphones behind you, and we will do a quick swap over to seats. And I'm going to say thanks very much. Everyone give them a good clap. And I'm going to ask colleagues to come and sit in your place. Gianpiero, why don't you come and sit? Who is the climate change specialist from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and Graham Watson, Division Chief for the Inter-American Development Bank. Okay, let's go for it. Gianpiero, one of EBRD's areas of expertise has actually been doing the thing that we've talked about a lot, which is getting the private sector mobilized to support adaptation finance. We all want to know how you're doing on that job. So give us a perspective on that, and you know, how you're approaching it. What can we learn from EBRD?
Thank you very much for the question. Thank you for having me here. It's an interesting question, not an easy one to address. So let me just be very transparent. We are not doing enough, and we are not having enough traction in this aspect. Despite, you know, we've done a lot of analysis trying to understand the solutions. And clearly, being primarily a private sector-oriented organization, 3/4 of what we do, in fact, uses private sector channels. It's still quite difficult to find the commercial drivers for private companies to invest in adaptation. Again, we're not talking anymore about cost, we're talking about investments, and that's quite critical because we want to identify what are the benefits of investing in adaptation projects in terms of increased value of assets, increased cost of disruptions, and this is the narrative and the approach we are really trying to introduce in the way we engage with private clients. Yet, the level of adaptation finance is not anywhere near what it should be. And again, Baisa gave us an indication about, you know, the major gap in the international climate finance towards adaptation. Now, maybe I'll give you, though, a few of the ideas that we are currently exploring and applying. There are many, in fact, many things we are trying to do. I'll maybe focus on three. One is the work we do in terms of adopting new financial approaches. For example, we are increasingly using result-based finance approaches to scale up adaptation finance, using, for example, sustainability linked loans approaches, whereabout we introduced climate adaptation KPIs as a part of the financial structure. One example, a project in a very recent project in Ukraine, which is a country that we have, it's very much part of, at the core of our activity. It's a loan to Astarte, is a major agribusiness company that operate under 2,000 hectares of land. So as a part of our loan, they have committed to increase substantially the amount of land that adopt regenerative agricultural practices. These entail a number of benefits. One is, of course, reduced amount of inputs, but also very much reduced amount of water use. And Astarte operates in part of the country which are exposed to disrupted rainfall patterns, and because irrigation, in particular in the southern part of Ukraine, is not particularly available, this entails really improve the resilience of their operations. There's one example. So sort of I would call it financial innovation up to an extent. A second example is the work we do to connect adaptation investments to the green capital markets. At EBRD in 2019, I think we've been the first MDB issuing climate resilience bonds. There was a methodology developed together with the Climate Bond Initiative. We've been issuing over €1 billion of bonds based on our portfolio of adaptation investments in infrastructure sector in particular. And we're trying now to use this methodology to engage with a variety of clients, corporate clients, but also, for example, municipal clients that are increasingly looking into adaptation investments at the city level. And the third example is perhaps more focused on SMEs. We have developed for quite some time a tool which we call Green Technology Selector, which is a web-based B2B platform where companies can upload their technologies. And this technology cover a wide variety of sectors. They cover energy efficiency, they cover small-scale renewable energy, they cover heating and cooling. But crucially, there are a number of technologies there that are really targeting adaptation investments, from drip irrigation technologies to sensor and management systems. And basically, these technologies, this kind of list of technologies, catalog of technologies, an open source platform, whereabout SMEs in particular can look at what type of solutions they can adopt in their operations, and they can utilize these also to get finance from the financial intermediaries that we finance.
I want to go to Julia in a moment just to talk a little bit about the capital market side. But before I do, how does the methodology fit into all of these initiatives that EBRD is doing?
It fits in two ways, I must say. Actually, I want to do a small detour, because clearly all of us, we are all applying, a Paris alignment approach in our operation. Any new operation is reviewed in respect to the Paris alignment. And I must say that now that we screen systematically 100% of our investments, this is a way to actually have a better understanding of physical climate risk. And clearly this entails a conversation with our clients and opens up the space to identify actions, measures, sometimes investments that can reduce the exposure to climate risk. And clearly the methodology helps, because particularly when we look at the enabling part of the methodology, it's a way to engage with our clients and try to achieve systemic improvements in the way they operate their business. So it's about really changing the business model and the way they integrate climate considerations in their corporate practices and in their decision-making processes.
Which to an extent has happened already in the mitigation space, but this is about pushing that in adaptation. Julia, maybe I can ask you a little bit about what you're doing at the Asian Infrastructure Bank in terms of you have issued Asia's first adaptation bond earlier this year. You have just launched your inaugural climate action plan as well. So tell us a bit about how that works and how does, I mean, maybe if I can also pick up on what I also asked Gianpiero, how does the methodology fit, for example, with the new bond? Is there a relevance there?
Yes, no, thanks, Sherry. Maybe I'll start with the climate action plan because I think it's very important to underline and kind of set the context as to what are the key messages that we're trying to say there. So what we try to bring in our climate action plan is to basically say that the battle against climate change will be won or lost in Asia. And that is because Asia is not only the largest emitter, but it's also the place that is mostly vulnerable to climate change. It's the place where most of the natural disasters are happening. And it's also the place with extremely strong growth potential. It's a place where there's a lot of infrastructure needs. There's $1.5 trillion US needed to invest in infrastructure every year by 2030. And so, like Karim said, the infrastructure is not only a solution, but it's also a problem because it's also one of the largest emitters. So understanding that and realizing that our climate action plan speaks to kind of 4 principles, and I think they also corresponding to this needs to understand the country needs. So we are only really emphasizing that we are a client-driven bank, that we're looking at the country sector platforms and looking at the different approaches where countries tell us what are their actual needs in this regard. Second thing is the holistic approach. We're really trying to emphasize that you need to look at both mitigation and adaptation as well as nature-based solutions, looking at how it can contribute and help nature. So we're trying to say every single project will be looking to make sure it maximizes all of the benefits. Third point in there, which speaks to the private sector mobilization and our work with the issuance of the adaptation bond. Second one as an MDB, but first one for Asia is looking how we can bring in more private sector capital. So by issuing the bond, we want to also raise the awareness in the market that adaptation is actually an investable case, that there is interest in there and that we have a good and strong pipeline and we can use our credit ratings and as a strong bond issuer in this space to raise awareness and bring the understanding that there is a strong investment case in adaptation. And that's also linking to the work we do with the private sector clients as well. I'm glad to say that, for example, we've also financed a project with TKSB together, financing it with the Turkish Development Bank, where we also looked at what they're doing in this field. And so the methodologies is helping us in a sense because we, first of all, doing it jointly. So the project we're co-financing with other MDBs, then the clients actually hear that we are asking for the same type of questions, because the problem arises when you speak to different MDBs and they say, well, we're asking you for this type of information and the other MDB is asking us for a different type of information. So having a common methodology is really helpful for our clients as well, because then we're speaking to the same language and asking for the same things. And one last point also to emphasize is what is great about this methodology is that it's really linking to our Paris alignment methodologies, right? So we've talked about that earlier on the principles on the Paris alignment, how we assess the projects against their mitigation goals and their adaptation goals. So those are actually, when it comes to adaptation analysis, are very linked to the adaptation tracking methodology. They're following practically the same principles. So I think what we're trying to establish in this community amongst us MDBs is to make sure that we're constantly building on the same principles, building on the same methodologies and approaches, and that is also, as in return, is helping our clients to do the same.
Thank you so much for that, Julia. You mentioned nature-positive investments, and actually I wanted to ask Graham a bit about that. So that was a nice segue into that topic. Graham, you're division chief at the Inter-American Development Bank, and I know this is an area where you, as an institution, have been very active, actually, leading the way in lots of areas. But just to remind people, the MDBs here in this very room launched new principles on tracking nature-positive investments, which was, quite groundbreaking in many ways. So to what extent can we find that sweet spot between the nature-positive and the adaptation? Where are the opportunities, Graham, do you think, for adaptation action using these nature-based, nature-positive approaches?
So I think this is working.
Yes, if you keep talking, they'll make sure it works.
I'm going to start off talking a little bit about what we're doing with adaptation to place it in the context of what we actually do with adaptation. And
sure.
I think the questions that were raised in the first panel, for example, what are we doing to help countries?
Yeah.
I think MDBs are perfectly positioned to help countries move forward their agenda. And just to give you some numbers on this, we're helping adaptation planning and policy in 13 countries in Latin America. We're helping disaster risk management in 18 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And that help runs from the planning processes all the way through policies, all the way through sector changes, and even down to subnational levels. For example, in Chile right now, we're actually helping develop the methodologies for landing the legislation they have in cities. And how do you do that? So this is one area where the MDBs are very well positioned to provide technical assistance to move that forward. The second block of activities are those of the direct investments, but I wanted to emphasize a point already made, that one big block of investments is policy lending. So you can not only provide the technical assistance, but then you can support the country because there are additional costs in implementing policies, so you can actually provide the cash that means that that's not going to take away fiscal space from the country. And that's absolutely crucial for a country, especially countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that are fiscally strapped right now. But that's not the only kind of financing you can do. We can use concessional financing to drive transformation, to create pipelines, to deal with the problem of the fact that adaptation is about upfront spending, doesn't have revenue streams, so it's a double problem. There's two sets of problems. And you gave me a very difficult question because you added a third thing that has no revenue streams as well. But to give you examples of the kinds of projects that I think are going to be the future, that are direct investments, we did one. The first project we did this year was a project in Recife where we built the whole capacity of the city to respond to flooding. Problem identified, but then you have to do everything associated with that. You have to think about moving people away from high-risk areas. You have to use nature-based solutions in the context of the city. You have to strengthen. In some cases, it has to be gray strengthening to actually move the agenda forward. You need to rebuild the city. And once you've moved the people from the informal neighborhoods into other places, these are highly complex projects, but impact, huge in being able to do that. We also invest in disasters issues. So for example, we have $3.9 billion out there at the moment in 17 countries, or where 17 countries can access this money. What happens when you have a disaster? How do you deal with it? How do you respond? How do you react? Something we started with Barbados, it's also in the Bridgetown Initiative, is also the question of let's stop asking people to pay back principal when they get hit. They don't have any fiscal space, and then whatever fiscal space they've got to use to be able to deal with emergency. So these are the kinds of innovations. And we also need to keep building capacities, because the reality of MDBs is that we can't be everywhere and can't be everything to everyone. So the fact of the matter is we need to build as much capacity as we possibly can and move that capacity forward, often in regional approaches. So here in COP, we launched One Caribbean. We talked a lot about Amazon Forever. We have actually two other programs that we're looking at now, and this week I've been discussing with, for example, Paraguay, southern Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, the problems they're facing. They've had 3 years of drought. Their agricultural productivity has taken a massive hit. You're talking about 5% impacts on the GDP. I was going to say it in Spanish. But these are huge impacts for countries like that. And those need to be managed and looked at. But it's a regional problem. They're all sharing the same problem, and they can learn lessons from each other. On the nature thing, and I'll do it quickly, but you really did give me the triple whammy.
I did.
I mean, there aren't revenue streams associated with this. It's upfront spending that you're going to maybe get paid back later on. It's quite a problem. So what are we doing? Firstly, I want to emphasize this. Our president did it. We are trying to be at the forefront of MDB reform. We're trying to change. Our new strategy incorporates climate and biodiversity as a frontal goal. In the same way that the World Bank's done this, I think ADB also has this. But that means that in the discussions in the countries, you have to be discussing this issue up front. No more thinking just about poverty and just about economic growth. It's the package. It's climate and development. And I think that point's well taken too. That this is national development you're talking about. We're innovating. We're trying to think about how to deal with this problem? How do you bring in private sector? How do you think about so and just to give you some, I'm going to throw the names out because we've been discussing them in different, the question of natural asset companies, tokenization, the debt for nature and climate conversions that we've been looking at, where we add guarantees. Yes, it's remortgaging your house and trying to use money from that, but whatever way works, it's really quite desperate, and we need to move forward. Risk transfer mechanisms, using insurance to try and move things around, and results-based lending, which I do think has a lot of potential for reducing cost of capital, and much more perhaps than thematic bonds. In our experience, green bonds have not had the green premium, but these sustainability-linked bonds tend to actually reduce cost of capital. And we're basically turning all of our capacities and our partnerships to this end. So if you look at who we're working with, whether it's the UK, France, Germany, United States, everybody's putting money in this direction to try and build this capacity to move the agenda forward. We took a step back and asked, are we actually using nature-based solutions? Most banks don't even know this, but they actually are already. So we counted $2 billion over 5 years that we already been put in place.
Yes.
So we were already doing it. We just need to think about how to broaden it out and expand it. And in most cases, those are justified economically. So it makes sense. Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to finish on just repeating that message that if you can compile these things together and do it regionally, you bring economies of scale that then allow you to be able to channel more financing into particular regions. This is what seems to be working with Amazon Forever. We're gaining a lot of attention. We have the leadership of the countries. The leaders are out there talking about it. It's bringing in finance that actually is concessional finance to begin with, but other kinds of finance. Hopefully we can do the same thing with this concept of One Caribbean. We have the issue in Central America, same issue in Central America as we have in Southern Com. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Graham. That was a really rich answer, and I'm sure the audience appreciated it. Speaking of the audience, any questions from you before we start wrapping up with the panel here? If so, do let me know. Otherwise, I do have a final question for each of you, if you can answer it succinctly. I think we've got a lot to think about, and very much a message coming from the panel earlier, and I think touched on very well by Graham there, is that we will have to have a more regional approach, a more country-focused approach. It is reassuring that the MDBs in their overall statement near the beginning of the COP did emphasize that progress on country platforms, long-term strategies, something that the Bridgetown Agenda has been also calling for. So, but I want to ask, we're near the end of COP now. They are busy in the big room over there, negotiating. What would you like to see coming out of the negotiations in the outcome statement that really gets to grips with what we've been talking about today? Getting the finance into the adaptation projects, dealing with particularly the predicament that communities in the most vulnerable parts of the world, who are often the least able to cope with these disasters, how are we going to do that? So I'm going to ask you, Gianpiero, what do you want to see coming out of the COP outcome statement?
Thank you. There are many things I would like to see, so it's very difficult to select.
But I mean on adaptation.
But
and
on
maybe
adaptation, I think two things. Clearly, a sort of structure framework that lead to the conversation on the global adaptation goal. That's very important because we give very powerful signals to the MDBs, community, to the countries in the first place, but also to the broader market. And I would like also to reflect on, there is a gap in availability of co-financing instruments for adaptation. So I would like to see more countries pledging more funding towards adaptation. Okay. Because that will help us structuring the transaction, provide technical assistance, but also very much, scaling up leveraging our finance to achieve more results.
Yeah. And maybe I'll nuance that question for you, Graham, a tiny bit. What would you like to see and what do you think is possible today? Tomorrow.
Answer, and I've said this several occasions in different events, let's be real about the finance. Let's stop dreaming and actually say how much money there is from the different sources and how much it's possibly going to increase. Because I think one of the problems I see in COP is we always talk about $1 billion, but nobody does the calculation about how much is $1 billion for 150 developing countries. It's 6-point-something million. Just let that sink in, because that's what $1 billion means. So we need to be honest and clear and pragmatic about, okay, how much is there in concessional finance? Where should that be used and how should it be used? How much is available for the MDBs? Yes, let's triple it. But it's still, for Latin America, it's only going to be 50 billion for Latin America and the Caribbean. Okay, but let's have that ready and go. Public and private, and then let's start thinking about innovating in those. And then I'll just finish very quickly. I do think the country platform, country-led concept is where we need to be and where we need to support countries. Roof to reef, got it right? Roof to reef. Low carbon development strategy in Guyana. Countries are already, it's not like they haven't been thinking about how to solve this problem. Let's get behind these plans and help them move forward with these innovations, with these sources of financing. Do what the Bridgestone Initiative thinks about. If we can get the SDRs, great. If not, let's go for something else. But let's solve it.
Okay. Julia, does it matter what kind of signal we get from the COP? Or is there a signal that you think would be helpful to advance this mission?
It very much matters, and it matters so much because we as MDBs, very much serve very broad communities across all of the world. So for us to have that signal on, what is the global goal on adaptation, the acknowledgement that there is not enough adaptation financing flowing currently, I think it's very important. We all know that it can come from a variety of sources, and saying that yes, it can come from public, private, and any other sources is very important, because we don't want to put all of the burden, again, to just the public financing institutions. But to put the goal out there and to say what it really is will then help us to, again, scale it down and speak to the partners and make sure that we can also report against that goal and against the results that we have achieved when there is an agreement of what it really is.
Thank you. That's a great point at which to end. So if you are listening, those of you in that big room, give us the signal. It matters. The MDBs are doing their bit. Obviously, can do a lot more. Everybody knows that. Thank you so much, Gian Piero, Graham, and Julia, for helping us, take this conversation to where it's gone. Thank you all of you earlier for the panel discussion, and to the audience as well. Thanks to those of you watching us online, and have a lovely day, and we'll all keep our fingers crossed that we get to the right point. Cinzia is signaling to me that she wants to say something.
Thank you. Sorry. I just wanted to acknowledge my co-chair, Latunji. Come here. As we finish our 3-year mandate, and I wanted to thank you, for all the work that we've done together, and thanks to all the members of the working group, and take the opportunity to invite you tomorrow, same place, same time, to talk about outcome. Today we talked about financial inputs for adaptation. Tomorrow we will talk about resilience outcome and metrics to measure the results of the adaptation finance. So come back tomorrow, same time, same place. Bye-bye.